Canadian Bulldog from Wrestling Merchandise and Memories. That's merchandiseandmemories.com. And today we're going to present 10 WCW pay-per-view posters that we need to talk about. As the de facto number 2 wrestling company for most of its existence, it became an accepted fact that WCW wasn't going to have glitzier or better produced shows than their WWF counterparts. While the wrestling was sometimes comparable, it usually seemed to lack the big fight feel that the WWF conjured up for, say, WrestleMania or SummerSlam. But the pay-per-view posters that WCW produced on a monthly basis were quite artistic. Some were great, some were terrible, but all of them were quite memorable. Let's take a look. Just before we get started, wanted to let you know that Wrestling Merchandise and Memories has more than 100 unique and conversation-starting top 50 lists on its site. Check it out at bit.ly/top 50 lists. What the hell is that supposed to be? A vampire? A wolfman? Kevin Nash after a few too many at the bar? Look, I get that Halloween Havoc was supposed to be a scarier pay-per-view and then they needed to have something a little different, but this had absolutely nothing to do with the main event or anything else on the show. History shows us that the main event of this show was Goldberg versus Sting for the WCW World Championship, and Manimal here was nowhere to be found. This one is almost as scary as that Wolfman picture. Like, whose idea was it to have Hulk Hogan, Sid Vicious, and Vampiro illustrated by the guy who draws for Cracked magazine? And let's talk about the theme of this particular event, a battle of heroic proportions. Vampiro, who's described as the mysterious Shadow Warrior, was clearly a heel in his Human Torch match against Sting, while Sid Vicious, master and ruler of the world, wasn't even on the card. And then Hulk Hogan, portrayed as the all-American hero, did take on Billy Kidman, but he was hardly portrayed as a real American for that match, brother. What? Come on now, this really has nothing to do with the show. Just a generic picture for a generic sounding pay-per-view. I'm calling, well, bullshit on this one. Look, I realize that WCW may not have been able to plan exactly which stars were appearing on the show months in advance when they were making up this poster, but they had to know some of the main guys on this roster. This just reeks of some marketing executive throwing an ad together. I mean, the main event was Sting versus Randy Savage for the WCW title. They couldn't have put one of those guys on the poster instead of Mantar? I'll be honest, back in the day, I used to hate this particular poster, but it's actually pretty good. For one thing, they actually got the main event right, as WCW champion Sting was defending against Sid Vicious, who is being energized Frankenstein-like by other members of the Four Horsemen. On top of that, Sting's face paint is in the shape of a freaking bat, and that alone earns high marks for me. Sure, the artwork, especially on Barry Windham, isn't the best, but for a pay-per-view poster in 1990, I'm going to say this was hang-on-your-wall worthy. Here's another pay-per-view poster that just nails it. For one thing, the image is ridiculously faithful to the show itself, as the main event of Mayhem that year was Scott Steiner versus Booker T in a straitjacket steel cage match, so full points there. For another thing, the photographer managed to capture the essence of Big Papa Pump as he's wearing said straitjacket, clearly pissed off with the world and bouncing around in an asylum-style room. And lastly, the poster prominently features Steiner's valet Medeja in a skimpy nurse outfit, which I'm not going to complain about. What the hell? This looks like one of those funny face flip books you'd buy rather than a legitimate poster trying to sell someone on a wrestling event. It just looks scary, you know? And this isn't even an ad for Halloween Havoc. Now, my best guess is that the 4 faces represented in this little puzzle are Ric Flair, Sting, Nasty Boy Sags, and Big Van Vader. And guess what, buddy? Not one of those guys was featured in the main event War Games match that this poster is supposedly advertising. I'm not trying to be racist. Really, I'm not. But just knowing the WCW roster at this time, the only person this could possibly be is Booker T. He even had that hairstyle around this time. So why is Book trying to make out with the World Championship title in outer space? I would say that he's pursuing the belt, which would fit in nicely with the Hold the Gold catchphrase of Super Bowl that year, but Booker T wasn't anywhere near the championship at that time. The main event was Sid Vicious versus Scott Hall versus Jeff Jarrett. Booker T was way down the card, losing his surname T to the likes of Big T. So it's not like they had huge plans for the guy at the time. Here's another instance where WCW accurately predicted the main event ahead of time as Sting battled Jake the Snake Roberts in the infamous spin the wheel, make the deal match. But I do have to wonder, why would Sting agree to pose for this poster, what with dangerous snakes slithering around him and everything? Maybe Bill Watts threatened to put the bat makeup on him again if he didn't play along. Talk about your turning points. According to this poster, WCW really has nothing to do with the wrestling. Instead, its main attractions are two hilarious barbecue chefs. See Bobby the Brain Heenan accidentally setting himself on fire? Isn't that hilarious? And what about Mean Gene Okerlund getting ready to grill up some WCW-shaped hamburgers? Too much. And while Heenan is my all-time favorite wrestling manager, and Mean Gene was actually the spokesperson for our predecessor website, I still take exception to this poster. It has absolutely nothing to do with the show, which was main evented by the Giant defending the WCW title against Lex Luger. There was no Grill Master cook-off to speak of. But what's more interesting is that this was the pay-per-view debut of the Outsiders, meaning the WCW was quickly transforming from comic relief barbecue antics to a legitimate wrestling company. This one is actually one of my favorite posters. It's one of the few pre-Hogan era WCW pay-per-views that casual and hardcore wrestling fans alike had interest in. Two established and well-respected wrestling stars in Ricky Steamboat and Rick Rude were squaring off in a 30-minute Iron Man match with a well-built and well-promoted backstory behind it that was several months in the making. The poster itself was a work of art with illustrations, and not silly cartoon ones, of both competitors preparing to square off in a sandcastle-themed ring. This match had everything: sand, surf, two legitimate icons, and a straightforward approach to promoting the match. Do you remember any of these pay-per-view posters? Are there any good ones that we missed? Leave a comment in the comment section below, be sure to thumbs up and like this video, and continue to watch for more great content on wrestling merchandise and memories.